The sun barely crested the horizon, spilling thin golden rays across the muddy, frostbitten camp. The smell of damp earth, mixed with the acrid tang of smoke from a dozen smoldering fires, clung to every breath. Soldiers moved like shadows in the fog, boots sloshing through icy puddles, their uniforms stiff from the bitter chill. In the center of it all, a figure shuffled between the tents, carrying a battered mess kit, its dents and scratches telling stories of countless mealtime battles fought long before the guns roared. They called him the cook, a title meant to humiliate, to remind him, and anyone watching, that he didn't belong on the battlefield. Private Thomas Allen, 22, tall in a way that made his clumsy gait even more obvious, tried to ignore the snickers. The men in his unit didn't see the hours he spent studying maps, calculating rations, memorizing weak points in German encampments. To them, he was just a boy with a spatula, a man whose hands knew flour and boiling water better than rifles and artillery. Yet, behind those quiet eyes burned a mind sharper than any of the soldiers laughing at him. He had learned early that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about imagination, observation, and timing. "Oi, cook, save some breakfast for the enemy." "Eh?" shouted Sergeant Briggs, a stocky man with a scar that split his cheek like a warning from some distant battle. Laughter erupted around the mess tent. Thomas dropped the ladle he was holding, letting it clang against a metal tray. His face burned, but he straightened his back. A faint smirk lingered on his lips, invisible to most. They didn't know. They never did. The day ahead promised more than the usual drills. Recon reports had indicated German patrols moving closer, suspiciously coordinated, unusually aggressive. The officers whispered of an impending assault, a strike that could unravel the fragile line they had fought so hard to maintain. Thomas listened as he filled the pots with water, his mind racing not with recipes, but with possibilities. Every shadow, every whistle of the cold wind carried warnings, and he knew, without a single word from his superiors, that his time to act might come sooner than anyone imagined. The soldiers moved past him, rifles clutched like lifelines, eyes scanning the horizon for what they assumed were enemy movements. Thomas, meanwhile, considered his own arsenal. Boiling grease, the kitchen's knives, anything that could be turned into a weapon in the right hands. The thought made him smile. Ridicule had its advantages. No one expected the cook to fight, which meant he had the element of surprise. He remembered the first day he arrived at the camp, the hazing, the whispered jokes that followed him through every tent. Men he had saved from frostbite and malnutrition would still glance at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. They didn't see the nights he spent studying German troop formations, the silent drills he ran with sticks instead of rifles. They didn't see the mind of the strategist lurking beneath the apron. As the sun rose higher, glinting off the dew-soaked earth, Thomas heard the distant rumble. The ground vibrated faintly, an almost imperceptible warning. The Germans were coming. Not a patrol, not a scouting party, but something larger. His heart pounded, not with fear but anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that could turn laughter into awe. The soldiers around him were unaware of the storm approaching. They loaded rifles, checked ammunition, argued about tactics, and cursed the cold. Every laugh, every careless comment, made Thomas's plan more vivid in his mind. He moved among them silently, gathering pots, boiling water, and the thick grease that would soon become his unexpected weapon. For years, he had endured ridicule, endured the kitchen boy jokes. And now, in these crucial hours before battle, those hours of scorn had forged something greater than muscle or firepower, ingenuity. The men who laughed at him, who whispered that he didn't belong on the line, would soon witness a lesson they would never forget. Smoke began rising from the eastern ridge. Shadows lengthened. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. Thomas Allen, the cook, adjusted his apron and wiped his hands on his trousers. Today, the kitchen tools he had mastered would become instruments of defense. Today, the boy with spatulas and pots would stand toe-to-toe with the enemy, not as a soldier by training, but as a warrior by necessity. From the ridge movement, German soldiers, dozens of them, creeping through the underbrush, confident, arrogant. They assumed weakness where there was none, And Thomas, hidden in plain sight among the tents, smiled. They didn't know him. They didn't know the boy who had studied their every step, every habit, every predictable move. As the first shots rang out in the distance, Thomas moved. Pots clanged. Grease boiled. Smoke filled the air. The soldiers who had once laughed at him now froze in disbelief as the cook became something more than they could have imagined. A force of nature wielding a kitchen's arsenal like a general commanding artillery. Every clang, every hiss, every scream became part of the symphony Thomas orchestrated. He was no longer the cook. He was the unexpected defender, the boy they had mocked turned savior. And as the German lines faltered, chaos spreading through their ranks, Thomas Allen understood something he had known all along. Sometimes, the most underestimated person is the one who changes the course of history. The battle that morning would be remembered, not for the artillery, not for the rifles, but for the kitchen boy who defied every expectation. The men who had mocked him, the soldiers who had doubted him, now watched in awe as the cook's boiling grease turned ridicule into legend. Before the mud, the frost, and the chaos of the battlefield, Thomas Allen had lived a life that seemed far removed from war. He was born in a small, sun-baked town in Texas, where the summers were scorching and the winters carried a dry, brittle chill. His parents were simple folk. His father a mechanic who could coax life out of any engine. His mother a woman whose laughter filled every corner of their modest home. It was she who taught him the art of patience, the importance of observation, and most importantly, how to treat every living being with care, whether human or animal. From a young age, Thomas had a natural curiosity. He would watch the steam rise from his mother's pots, fascinated by how heat transformed raw ingredients into sustenance. He spent hours in the kitchen, not as a chore, but as a laboratory where flavors, textures, and timing were tested endlessly. A good cook can save a life, his mother often said, her hands dusted in flour. But a clever one can save many. At the time, Thomas didn't fully grasp the meaning, but those words settled in his mind, waiting for the right moment to reveal their significance. School was no refuge for Thomas. He was lanky, awkward, and more interested in solving mechanical problems or reading maps than joining the games that other boys played. Kids would mock him, call him the little cook, as if the kitchen was some place to hide rather than a source of ingenuity. Yet, Thomas found solace in observation. He noticed how the bullies moved, how the timid students reacted, how small choices could shift outcomes. Those early lessons in human behavior, coupled with his love for precision and experimentation, would later become tools far more valuable than any rifle. When the war reached American shores, Thomas enlisted, not out of a burning sense of heroism, but because he wanted to be useful. He didn't imagine himself in the thick of battle. He envisioned support, planning, logistics. Yet the military had its own rules, and a young man with a knack for cooking was quickly assigned to the mess hall. To his comrades, this confirmed their low expectations. The cook was not a fighter. He was someone who ladled soup, scrubbed pots, and kept the barracks fed. The whispers followed him wherever he went, a constant reminder that no one took him seriously. But Thomas was not deterred. Every morning before the first bell, he would rise earlier than the rest, practicing knife skills with makeshift targets, testing the boiling point of grease, imagining how everyday kitchen tools could become instruments of defense. He read tactical manuals in secret, studying enemy formations and historical battles. By day, he was a cook, but by night, he became a student of war, a strategist learning to leverage his environment in ways others couldn't imagine. His camaraderie with the soldiers was complicated. Many still mocked him openly, making jokes that stung more than the cold ever could. Keep stirring, cook. Maybe the Germans will taste your soup before the bullets. They would jeer. Thomas learned to nod, smile politely, and let their laughter wash over him. Behind that smile, however, his mind was sharpening, calculating, and preparing. He had learned early that those who underestimate you are your most valuable allies, because they will never see your true strength coming. Even in moments of reprieve, Thomas's life had shaped him uniquely. He remembered one particular summer evening back home, standing on the porch with his mother as the sun dipped below the horizon. A neighbor's barn was ablaze, threatening the livestock and everything the town held dear. The adults panicked, But Thomas had noticed a trick with a water hose, a way to divert the flames and save animals. He acted without hesitation, dousing the fire and saving dozens of lives. No medals were given. No one praised him. Yet the lesson was imprinted. Courage wasn't loud, it was practical. It was seeing opportunity in chaos and acting decisively. That instinct carried into his military life. The mess hall was his laboratory, the army camp his test ground. He began experimenting with grease, testing its boiling point, imagining how it could scald or trap an intruder. He played with the timing of kettles, the placement of pots, and even the acoustics of the camp. Every small detail cataloged in his mind. It might have seemed trivial to others, but Thomas knew that in war, details were life. A small advantage could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In quieter moments, Thomas reflected on the irony of his situation. A boy mocked for wielding a ladle would soon face men armed with rifles, trained killers who underestimated his resourcefulness. And he welcomed it. He understood that ridicule could be a shield. It lowered expectations, lulled the enemy into complacency, and gave him the perfect cover. If they thought he was harmless, they would never anticipate the storm he could unleash. The letters from home kept him grounded. His mother's words were filled with encouragement and quiet wisdom. "Remember Thomas," she wrote. "Heroes aren't always on the front lines. Sometimes they're the ones others overlook." Those letters were read and reread, each word fueling his resolve. In the mess hall, with the laughter of soldiers echoing around him, Thomas held on to that quiet truth. He was preparing, in his own way, for the moment when he could prove them all wrong. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. Reports filtered through the camp. German scouts had been spotted moving closer, more organized and confident than usual. Officers whispered about the impending assault, their voices tinged with anxiety. Soldiers checked their weapons, tension coiling in every muscle. Amid the preparation and fear, Thomas observed quietly every movement of his fellow soldiers, every adjustment of rifles, every glance toward the horizon was cataloged in his mind. He was ready. The cook, once a symbol of mockery, had become a silent strategist. The camp was his chessboard, the pots and pans his unconventional pieces. He understood the terrain, the schedules of the enemy, and most importantly, the psychology of those who thought him weak. By the time the Germans advanced, Thomas Allen was no longer just a boy with an apron. He was an unseen force, a calculated anomaly, a man ready to turn ridicule into legend. And so, as the first whispers of battle drifted across the frostbitten landscape, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a boy mocked in a Texas kitchen to a soldier underestimated by his peers. Every choice, every moment of patience, every secret study of strategy had led to this pivotal day. The world might call him the cook, but soon they would call him a hero. The stage was set. The enemy was approaching, and the cook, armed with nothing but boiling grease, sharp knives, and a mind that refused to accept limits, prepared to rewrite the rules of engagement. The morning fog hung thick over the camp, curling through the trees and drifting across the frost-crusted ground like a silent warning. Soldiers moved cautiously, their boots crunching against frozen mud, rifles gripped tightly, eyes scanning every shadow. The once lively camp had fallen eerily quiet. Laughter from the previous days was replaced by tension, whispers, and the occasional barked order from officers. The German threat had grown more tangible with every passing hour, and a sense of inevitability had settled over the men. Thomas Allen moved among them, carrying his pots and ladles, his face calm, almost serene. To the soldiers, he was still the cook, still the boy who made jokes easy to throw at. But beneath the apron, his mind raced like a storm. Every scrap of intelligence he had gathered, every observation of enemy behavior, every trick he had devised in the quiet hours of night, now coalesced into a single plan. Today, the kitchen would become a battlefield, and Thomas, its unlikely commander. From a ridge, faint shadows moved. German scouts, dressed in drab gray, their rifles slung carelessly, crept through the underbrush with confidence. They had no idea that someone among the camp's supposed non-combatants had been watching them, anticipating their every move. Thomas knelt briefly to adjust the position of a cooking pot, its contents simmering quietly, a seemingly ordinary breakfast preparation. To anyone else, it was mundane. To him, it was a key part of the defense, a carefully calculated element in a plan that could save hundreds of lives. The soldiers around him were tense, but unprepared for what was to come. Sergeant Briggs barked orders, checking rifle sights, counting ammunition, pacing like a predator stalking his prey. Private eyes darted nervously to Ridge, anticipating the first crack of gunfire. They were seasoned men, but fear had sharpened every sense. And yet, they overlooked the quiet man in the middle of their camp, the cook, the boy they had mocked, whose every move carried hidden intent. Thomas moved with practiced precision, setting up stations where boiling grease would soon be poured, positioning knives for quick access, and placing heavy pots as barriers. His mind was a flurry of calculations, timing the enemy's approach, the angle of the rising sun, the wind's direction, the exact moment when movement would give him the advantage. Each detail mattered. A single misstep could cost lives, including his own. The camp animals, too, seemed to sense the tension. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, ears flicking to every sound, while the occasional chicken squawked, startled by the silence. Thomas used these distractions to his advantage, positioning them in ways that would confuse the approaching Germans, creating minor obstacles that could slow their advance and increase their vulnerability. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretching like an eternity. The soldiers grew restless, muttering among themselves, unaware that the kitchen boy was readying a defense that would turn the tide of the battle. Thomas's heart beat steadily, a calm rhythm in contrast to the chaos he anticipated. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, imagining the surprise, the chaos, the fear on the faces of those who underestimated him. A distant snap, a twig breaking underfoot, made every soldier's head snap toward the ridge. The Germans were closer now, their movements deliberate, their confidence unshaken. The officers consulted maps, trying to predict the enemy's path, while Thomas adjusted a pot of boiling grease, ensuring it would tip at the precise moment when the first wave of attackers arrived. Timing, he knew, was everything. Private Jenkins, a young man barely 18, nudged a friend. "You think the cook can really fight?" he whispered, doubt coloring his tone. His friend shrugged, glancing at Thomas. The cook smiled faintly but said nothing, allowing the uncertainty to linger. Ignorance, after all, was a weapon just as powerful as any rifle. The Germans expected soldiers to guard them. They did not expect the cook to stand ready with boiling grease. As the sun rose higher, piercing the fog, Thomas felt the vibrations of movement through the frozen ground. The German soldiers were advancing in formation, their boots crunching in rhythm, rifles glinting in the early light. Each step they took was a heartbeat. Each breath they drew a signal that the moment was near. Thomas checked his preparations one final time. Every pot, every barrier, every tool was in place. The battlefield had been transformed from a simple camp into a maze of unexpected defenses. Suddenly, the distant crack of a rifle echoed across the ridge. A warning shot, perhaps, or the first note of chaos to come. The soldiers tensed, weapons raised, eyes wide, yet their focus remained on the ridge, on the expected threat. They did not see Thomas, calm in the center of camp, his mind calculating, his body poised. They did not see the young man whose laughter they had once mocked, whose very presence had been a source of ridicule, now transformed into a force capable of holding back an advancing army. Time seemed to slow as the Germans approached the outer perimeter. Each second was filled with anticipation, tension thick enough to taste. Thomas imagined the scene unfolding. The first wave of soldiers stepping into the trap, the boiling grease cascading, the surprise and confusion erupting among the attackers. The mental image brought a quiet smile to his lips. Ridicule had sharpened him. Patience had guided him, and now preparation would make him lethal. And then a shadow flickered across his vision. The enemy scouts had reached the perimeter earlier than expected. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from a thrill of opportunity. Everything depended on precision. A single miscalculation could turn triumph into disaster. With a final glance at his fellow soldiers, who were still unaware of the hidden plan unfolding within their own camp, Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself for the moment when the cook would become a hero. The first German foot crossed the invisible line Thomas had drawn in the mud. In that instant, everything shifted. The calm before the storm shattered. The battle, long anticipated, had begun, and the boy they had mocked, the cook, was ready to prove that heroism could come from the most unexpected places. The first German soldier stepped into the camp, his boots crunching against the frozen earth, unaware of the trap that awaited him. To him, the camp was quiet, seemingly unguarded, a simple encampment ripe for plunder. What he did not know was that the young man they had mocked, the cook who ladled soup in polished pots, had spent months preparing for this moment. Every detail, every observation, every experiment with boiling grease, heavy pots, and subtle distractions had led to this exact instant. Thomas Allen's eyes tracked the soldier with a predator's precision. His hands moved with deliberate calm. Lifting a large pot of boiling lard, he positioned on a reinforced table. To any observer, it seemed like another mundane task in the kitchen, a cook simply tending to his duties. But Thomas had calculated the exact trajectory, the angle at which the pot would spill, the distance it would cover, the impact it would have. He waited for the optimal moment, his heart steady, his mind focused. And then it happened. The first wave of Germans was too close to their target. Thomas tipped the pot with precise force, sending a cascade of scalding grease down the narrow path the soldiers had unknowingly chosen. The effect was instantaneous. Screams pierced the morning fog as a hot liquid seared uniforms and skin, sending men scrambling in every direction. Panic erupted, the order of the German formation collapsing like a house of cards. Thomas watched, unflinching, as the chaos he had meticulously designed unfolded. But he did not stop there. Every second was crucial. As the enemy floundered, Thomas moved like a shadow, using his surroundings to his advantage. Pots of boiling water, strategically placed knives, and overturned carts became his weapons. Each maneuver was calculated to maximize disruption, while minimizing risk to his own men. Soldiers who had once doubted him now saw him in a new light, though they were too busy dodging attacks to fully comprehend the brilliance of his tactics. The Germans, trained and confident, were thrown into disarray. Their rifles misfired, tangled in underbrush, and officers shouted futile orders that went unheeded. They had underestimated the camp, underestimated the cook, and now faced the consequences. Thomas moved among them like a force of nature, boiling grease in one hand, a makeshift spear in the other, exploiting every opening with ruthless efficiency. One soldier tried to charge at him, thinking that sheer aggression would overcome the unexpected defense. Thomas sidestepped with uncanny precision, swinging a heavy ladle to knock the rifle from the man's grasp. The soldier faltered, stunned by the unexpected resistance of someone they had considered harmless. Around them, the camp had transformed into a battlefield, each object a potential weapon, each movement a calculated advantage. As the German line faltered, Thomas's mind raced ahead. He knew reinforcements were on the way, that the chaos he had created might not hold forever. Yet he remained calm, relying on meticulous preparations that had consumed months of his life. Traps set days prior, hidden tripwires, precarious barrels, and strategically placed debris, now triggered in perfect sequence, multiplying confusion. Every sound of pain, every shout of surprise, every sudden movement of a soldier was orchestrated in the symphony of controlled chaos Thomas had envisioned. The soldiers around him, initially in disbelief, now followed his lead instinctively. Sergeant Briggs, wide-eyed, shouted instructions, but deferred to Thomas's calculated commands. Cook, the left flank. He barked, realizing that the boy they mocked had an acute understanding of battlefield dynamics that surpassed anyone else present. Private Jenkins, the same young man who had doubted Thomas's abilities hours earlier, moved to reinforce a barricade under his guidance, his fear replaced by awe. The Germans were losing cohesion, their once formidable presence reduced to frantic attempts to survive. Every misstep was amplified by Thomas's preparation. Boiling grease, overturned carts, and strategic obstructions had turned a simple assault into a nightmare. The enemy's confidence crumbled under the weight of ingenuity and improvisation, and the camp that had been mocked as defenseless now became an impenetrable fortress. Not of stone or steel, but cleverness, preparation, and resolve. Amid the chaos, Thomas noticed a group attempting to flank from the right. He didn't hesitate. With a precise motion, he triggered a hidden cache of heavy cooking pots, sending them rolling down the slope in a controlled avalanche. The sound of metal clanging against metal, the shouts of confusion, and the scrambling of soldiers created a momentary pause in the enemy's advance. Every soldier in the camp seized the opportunity, reinforcing barricades, taking cover, and following Thomas's lead. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Thomas's body ached, his muscles burned, but his mind remained sharp. Each second counted, each action a vital thread in the tapestry of survival. The Germans, demoralized and battered, began to retreat, their order broken, their confidence shattered. Thomas pursued only cautiously, aware that overextending could cost lives. This was not a moment for reckless heroism. It was a moment for precision, patience, and strategy. By the time the smoke cleared and the fog lifted, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The German attack had been thwarted, not by overwhelming force, but by intelligence, preparation, and the ingenuity of a boy they had laughed at. Soldiers who had once mocked Thomas now regarded him with respect bordering on reverence. The cook, ridiculed and underestimated, had rewritten the rules of engagement, demonstrating that courage and creativity could rival even the deadliest of weapons. And in the aftermath, as the camp recovered, Thomas Allen stood quietly, observing the results of his work. He did not boast. He did not seek recognition. For him, the victory was in the lives saved, in the order preserved, in the knowledge that preparation and ingenuity had triumphed where brute force alone might have failed. The battlefield had become his canvas, and he had painted a masterpiece of strategy and courage, a lesson in humility, respect, and the hidden power of the overlooked. The morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light over a camp forever changed. Silence now replaced the chaos, a heavy, reflective quiet that hung over the soldiers. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of scorched earth, and the lingering tang of fear transformed into relief. Every man in the camp knew they had survived something extraordinary, a moment that would be whispered about for years to come, a story that defied expectations. Thomas Allen, the boy who had been ridiculed, now moved through the camp with measured steps. His uniform bore stains, grease, mud, and the marks of a battle fought in the shadows, but his eyes were calm, scanning the faces of the soldiers he had saved. Some stared in awe, others silently nodded, realizing that the kitchen boy they had mocked had become the unexpected hero of the day. No words could fully express what they felt. Respect and gratitude lingered in the air, unspoken yet profound. Sergeant Briggs approached, his expression a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Allen, I don't know what to say," he stammered, the words heavy with emotion. You saved us all. You didn't just cook. You led." Thomas offered a quiet smile, brushing grease from his apron. "We all survived," he replied simply, deflecting praise. But deep down, he understood the gravity of the moment. The difference between life and death had rested in his hands, and he had not faltered. The soldiers began inspecting the camp, taking stock of the aftermath. German weapons lay scattered, bent, or broken. Barricades had held firm. The clever traps Thomas had set were untouched or triggered to perfection. Each discovery brought renewed admiration and incredulity. Private Jenkins, once skeptical, now found himself telling every man he could about the cook who had become their savior. He did everything," Jenkins whispered, voice filled with awe. "Every step, every move, he thought of it all." Thomas walked slowly to the edge of the camp, looking out over the frozen terrain where the battle had unfolded. The ridges and valleys that had once seemed so foreboding now seemed conquered, familiar in a way that only those who had fought there could understand. He thought of the German soldiers, their confidence shattered, their advance halted by ingenuity rather than brute force. The image of their surprise, their retreat, and their confusion replayed in his mind, a reminder of the power of preparation, courage, and quick thinking. The camp began to buzz quietly with stories. Soldiers recounted moments of near disaster, how a pot of boiling grease had changed the tide, how Thomas had guided them with precision. Laughter, relief, and disbelief intermingled as tales grew with each retelling. Thomas remained at the center of these stories, not seeking glory, but observing the transformation in the hearts of his fellow soldiers. He had been underestimated, laughed at, dismissed, Yet today, he had rewritten their understanding of bravery. Word of Thomas's action spread beyond the camp. Officers who had once ignored him now sought his counsel, amazed by the tactical genius displayed by someone so young and unassuming. Letters would later describe the battle as one of the most unexpected and remarkable victories of the campaign. Yet Thomas remained humble, knowing that preparation, observation, and ingenuity had made the difference, not luck or chance. In the quiet moments, Thomas reflected on what had happened. The fear, the adrenaline, the tension, they had shaped him. The ridicule he had endured had prepared him, teaching patience, resilience, and the importance of being underestimated. The battle had proven that heroism could emerge in the most unlikely places, that courage was not measured by size or rank, but by clarity of mind and decisiveness in action. He thought of the soldiers he had saved, their lives intertwined with his own in that single, defining moment. Each man carried memories of fear, survival, and respect. They would remember the cook, not as a boy with ladles and pots, but as a leader, a strategist, a hero who would turn the tide with ingenuity and bravery. For Thomas, the greatest reward was not recognition, but the knowledge that he had fulfilled a duty beyond expectation, that he had honored the trust placed in him by those who had once doubted him. As the camp slowly returned to routine, Thomas continued his work in the kitchen, but everything had changed. He no longer moved through life as the boy who cooked. He moved as a man who had faced fear, mastered it, and emerged victorious. Soldiers sought his advice, shared stories, and watched him with newfound respect. The camp, once a place of hierarchy and mockery, had transformed into a community that recognized talent, courage, and initiative wherever it appeared. Even years later, the story of Thomas Allen would be told and retold. Young soldiers would hear the kitchen boy who stopped a German attack with boiling grease and clever strategy. Historians would marvel at the improbable victory, the ingenuity displayed, and the bravery of a man underestimated by everyone around him. The lesson was clear. Heroism is not confined to battlefield, to those with guns and rank. It can emerge in the shadows, from quiet corners, from those who prepare, observe, and act with precision when the moment demands. And Thomas Allen, the boy who had once been laughed at, now stood as a symbol of courage, strategy, and the extraordinary power of the overlooked. He had taken ridicule, turned it into resolve, and proven that the smallest actions, the quietest minds, and the least expected heroes could change the course of history. As the sun set over the camp, casting long shadows across the snow and frost, Thomas looked out over the men he had saved. Their faces reflected relief, awe, and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. In that moment, he realized something profound. Bravery is not about glory, and heroism is not about recognition. It is about action, preparation, and the unwavering commitment to protect those who depend on you. The legend of Thomas Allen, the cook who became a hero, would live on. And for every young soldier who ever doubted themselves, who ever felt small or powerless, his story would serve as a reminder. Sometimes, the most extraordinary victories come from the most ordinary people, armed not with fame or rank, but with courage, ingenuity, and a determination to act when it matters most. Victory is rarely without cost. Thomas Allen's brilliance had saved lives, but it had left marks invisible to the eye. The physical exhaustion was immediate. Sore muscles, blistered hands, and a fatigue that seeped into every bone. Yet the emotional toll ran deeper. He had witnessed fear, pain, and fragility of life in its rawest form. Every soldier he saved, every German enemy he delayed, reminded him of how thin the line between survival and death could be. That evening, the camp fell into a heavy silence. Soldiers cleaned weapons, repaired barricades, and whispered among themselves about the day's events. Thomas retreated to a quiet corner, sitting on a frozen crate, lost in thought. His mind replayed the screams, the confusion, the faces of men who had been moments from doom. He felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of being the unlikely pivot upon which hundreds of lives had turned. Yet amidst the gravity, Thomas also felt pride. Pride not for himself, but for what human ingenuity and courage could achieve. He understood, more clearly than ever, that heroism was rarely glamorous. It was gritty, uncomfortable, and demanded sacrifice. And though he had acted alone at critical moments, He recognized that he was part of something larger, a chain of courage that ran through every soldier, every decision, every small act of resilience in the camp. That night, sleep came fitfully. Dreams were haunted by moments of hesitation, missteps narrowly avoided, and the faces of those he could not save in other battles. Yet Thomas also dreamed of the future, of peace, of the ordinary life that might follow, and of the knowledge that one person's ingenuity could ripple outward in ways unimaginable. He did not know when or if history would remember him, but he knew that in that moment, he had acted with every ounce of his courage and skill. Weeks later, word of Thomas Allen's actions spread beyond the camp. Officers, journalists, and even historians took notice. Reports described a kitchen boy whose clever tactics had turned an otherwise devastating attack into a triumph of strategy and human ingenuity. Soldiers who had laughed at him now spoke of him with reverence. "He's not just a cook," Sergeant Briggs would tell new recruits. "He's proof that courage can come from anyone, anywhere." Thomas himself remained humble. He did not seek medals or praise. To him, recognition mattered little compared to the lives saved and the integrity maintained. Yet the world's attention brought new challenges. Interviews, letters, and requests for public appearances flooded in, each reminding him that the extraordinary often comes with extraordinary expectations. Still, Thomas stayed grounded, relying on the lessons of patience, preparation, and quiet resolve that had defined him in battle. Reflection became a daily ritual. He thought of the ridicule he had endured, the skepticism of his peers, and the doubt of those who underestimated him. Those moments now seemed almost like a necessary crucible, forging resilience and ingenuity in ways conventional training could not. Thomas realized that mockery had been his hidden ally. It had pushed him to anticipate every possibility, to plan for every contingency, and to develop the calm precision that ultimately saved lives. History would remember him as the cook who defeated a German attack. But Thomas knew the deeper truth. The victory belonged to the human spirit, to the capacity to adapt, improvise, and act decisively when the world least expects it. He had learned that heroism does not require grandeur, only courage, preparation, and the willingness to stand in the storm when others falter. Years passed, and Thomas Allen's story became legend in military circles. Books, letters, and oral histories recounted the day the kitchen boy turned the tide of battle. Young soldiers, both in training and in combat, heard the tale as a lesson in resourcefulness, courage, and the unexpected power of ingenuity. Museums displayed his carefully preserved kitchen tools, a testament to the idea that even the simplest objects could change history when wielded with skill and foresight. Thomas never sought fame. He lived quietly, occasionally sharing his experiences with eager listeners, always emphasizing one truth above all: preparation, observation, and courage can make the smallest person the greatest hero. His story inspired countless others, not because of fame or medals, but because it illustrated a timeless lesson that greatness often hides in overlooked places, in quiet individuals, and in ordinary moments transformed by extraordinary action. The men who had survived that battle carried his example into every corner of their lives. They spoke of him with reverence, passing on the story to sons, nephews, and young soldiers who needed proof that courage could come from anywhere. And Thomas, in his quiet way, continued to cook, to teach, and to inspire. He knew that the battlefield was just one stage, and that life itself demanded the same courage, ingenuity, and moral resolve. As the sun set on his life, Thomas Allen's legacy endured, not as a tale of glory or conquest, but as a story of human ingenuity, bravery, and the power of the underestimated. The kitchen boy, who had once been mocked, to become a symbol, a beacon, and a lesson for generations. And in every whisper recounting of that remarkable day, in every tear, smile, or gasp of awe from those who heard it, his story lived on, reminding the world that courage, creativity, and determination could triumph against any odds. The camp where he had acted, the soldiers whose lives he saved, and the history books that would one day record his deeds all stood as a testament to one simple truth. Heroism is not about rank, strength, or recognition. It is about the courage to act when the moment demands.